Aloha, friends of Ukulele Magazine. I'm Sarah Maisel, and I'm very excited about our third and final installment for Making the Leap. Now, we've talked about setting goals, we talked about warm-ups and scales, and now I want to take a deep dive into transitions. Now, this could be for single notes or it could be for chords, as we're going to be doing today. But I find that if you really take the time to hone in on each transition, you'll find that you'll become a better player overall. And the reason that I mention this and why I think it's so important is that you don't always play you don't always play a chord the same way depending on what comes before or after it. Yes, we learn to play C with our ring finger on that third fret of the A string. But I actually have 4 different ways that I can play that same chord, depending on what's going to come after it. For example, if I know an F7 is next, why not hold it with my pinky so that I can go to the next chord much more easily? So little things like that are something that I think really sets apart a beginner from a more intermediate player, because as an intermediate player, you're thinking ahead and you're really trying to be as efficient as possible. So one of the very first examples that I mentioned in the article is actually, it's an example one. It's just playing your C and remembering to use maybe your middle for A minor. And then all you have to do is add your index. And then if you leave your index as an anchor, you just add 2 fingers to make G7, right? That's not too bad. I would say 90% of you out there have already learned this particular chord progression, and it's, one that's very familiar, especially if you're into doo-wop music. But that's going to be the most efficient way of playing this particular one. I could actually even just use my pinky here instead of my ring so that I don't even have to slide that finger down. So I could also think of it that way as well. Again, just giving you another option. Now, the meat and potatoes of this video is actually going to be me going through the whole idea of playing scales and chords at the same time. I call it chord melody scales, but for me, I like thinking of my scale as my melody. And so you'll see that in example 2, I have a B flat major scale where I'm playing all of the notes on the A string. So you have 1st, 3, 5, and so on. Right? So I've got that scale happening all on my A string. Now, the next step would be to put chords in there. Now, if I list off sort of the 4 main B flats that you will find in your chord book, you'll see that I've got this B flat here, and then I would move up to the 5th fret to this B flat, which in some ways should kind of remind you of an F chord. I'm holding my index over the 5th and I'm creating what looks like an F chord underneath it. And then the next one should remind you of a shape many people don't really enjoy. Oh, sorry, 1 fret too low. So this is going to be 10, 10, 10, and then 8. Sorry, 8. Yes, that was correct. This guy right here. And then the next one is barring that 10th fret and having my pinky reach all the way to 13. Now, that's not all of those melody notes that I played from the scale, the single notes. It's just some of them. So what we're going to do now is fill in the gaps. Now, to me, the chord names are not as important. I gave you the chord names because there's going to be people out there that are like, well, what's it called? But I don't want you to fixate on what the names of the chords are. I want you to think of this as variations of B flat major. So you have your standard B flat major chords, right? And then you're going to end up adding notes. So in example number 4, you will see a B flat. And what I recommend in the article is taking your pinky, because that's your only free finger, adding it to that 3rd fret of your A string, like that. And then just practice back and forth, getting used to this, because many times you have not used your pinky in this fashion before. And so you might find that your pinky doesn't really want to listen to you. So just going back and forth and just doing reps, it's beautiful. It sounds lovely, adding in this extra note that you find in your scale. Also, you might notice rain coming in and out because it's raining here in Manoa Valley where we live. Then next up, we're going to go from this shape and we're going to transition to that B flat in the next position. Now watch my fingers for a second. I'm going to add here. My ring finger is actually already in the correct place. So leave that on your G string. My pinky lifts up, my index is going to come over, my middle, and then I end up putting him down. So that's something where I would go from this shape and then move up. Go back and then move it up. Just back and forth, getting used to, again, that transition. The next one doesn't really sound as good, where we're going to be adding the fourth note of our scale. But I'm going to do it anyway just because it's in our example, though you'll see I change it later in the article. My middle finger is going to go down and then lift it back up. Again, my middle is going to go down and cover the E and the A. Lift it back up. So that's the only note that's changing. Now this may be difficult for some folks because you're making your middle cover 2 strings. Sometimes I would say you could move over to 3, but you can't. You have to only cover 2. The other option is just playing the single note and then just moving that finger over and playing a single note. But don't worry, we're not going to spend too long on this particular variation of our scale because it's not the main one that I want you to focus on. I'm just showing it to you using your standard B-flat triads and kind of showing you how clunky I feel this particular one is, but we'll make it easier. So after doing this one, then we need to move up to this next one that a lot of people don't like to play. So again, that was that 10, 10, 10, and then 8. So going from here, what I tend to do is kind of start getting those fingers into position already. My index kind of goes ahead and starts sliding up with a 3. Some people might actually be able to do, I can't do it. You can see I'm having a hard time. There we go. I can get it clear maybe with a little bit of work, where I'm using my middle finger to hold down 2 strings, my G and my C, and then my ring is holding down the E and my index is on that A string. That might be easier for some of you. So you could certainly try that. And then my middle comes down if I'm doing it that way. And then I can add my pinky or my ring to that 12th fret and then slide up the pinky. I'd probably use my ring and then my pinky like that. If I was doing it this way, I could also switch to my index, use my ring and then my pinky. So you can also do it that way. But for me, this feels kind of clunky using just your B-flat triads, but it can be done. And you can hear the scale. I'm going to move forward now with it and just play through it a little bit slowly. So I have this is example 4, B-flat, add a friend, move it all up, and put one finger over 2 strings, move this guy, and then bar, and then add, and you can hear that scale happening, but we're also playing chords. Now, the reason why I think practicing chord melody scales is important is it's a gateway to chord melody. It's getting you to be able to play chords and a melody, your scale, at the same time. And if you remember from past articles, we said that the reason scales are so important is that scales are what is used to create melodies for songs. So if you practice this chord melody scale, you'll find that you'll actually be able to start playing chords in different positions and you'll start to hear melodies. I'll actually play through a little bit after I go through this next and much more preferred example of a chord melody scale. So example number 5. What I like about this is I'm actually going to be using some chord substitutions. It'll sound a little more, for lack of a better word, jazzy, because we're going to be using some major 6 chord shapes. And with this, again, don't fixate too much on the chord names, like, oh my gosh, what's a 6/9, etc. Just think of it as it's a B flat major chord that has extra color being added to it, whether it's the melody note or just that we are playing 4 different notes on, or yeah, 4 completely different notes. So a new note per string. So for example, that very first chord in example 4, I'm actually playing the exact same note on my G and my A string. So technically, I really only need to play those 3 strings, my C, E, and A string, to get that B flat. This string is extra. But if I take away my ring finger and I play B flat 6, which is open to 1/1, I have a different note happening on each string. So it's a little bit more full and a little more, as we say, colorful. So B flat 6. Now I use my pinky for the next note, which should feel familiar to you because that's what we did in the example prior. So now here we're going to actually do a different shape, which I find to be easier than going up and doing the bar. And that's going to be 3/5/3/5. So what I want you to do is wrap your fingers around this right now without worrying about a transition. Just listen to how beautiful that sounds. And again, it's a B flat 6 chord. It just is another variation of this first one. So again, we have that first one. I'm adding my pinky. My pinky is really my guide here because my pinky is going to slide up to 5 and then I move everyone around it. So again, B flat, add your pinky. And then notice that my ring is actually already kind of, it knows where it needs to go. It wants to go ahead and hover and come down. If you find that you're having trouble getting this shape, you can even start with holding the shape and lifting up 3 fingers and putting them down. And just doing this exercise to really allow you to get used to working those fingers in tandem. Just small, it's a small rep, but it's a good idea to try. So then, now this one I think is a lot easier. You're just scooting up your pinky 1. And it all sounds beautiful. You don't have any clashing notes like we did in the example prior. If you're not used to using your pinky in this manner, you may want to just go back and forth with your pinky a little bit just to get used to moving it 1 fret. Because sometimes you might find that your pinky doesn't listen to you. Remember, it's the finger that you use the least. So it's not going to be as talented as the rest. So going back and forth, getting used to here. Now this next one, you're actually, you're going to end up, these 2 fingers are actually on the correct strings, your ring and your pinky. And you're just going to be adding. I went too far, adding 2 fingers. So again, notice how these 2 fingers went up and they're the exact same amount apart. So I've got my ring on that 7th fret and my pinky on that 8th fret. And then I'm adding 2 fingers. So let's try that again, down here. Move up 2 and then add 2. If you need to just practice doing this, where you're just lifting up index and middle for a little bit, getting used to having these together, you can do that. Again. Eventually it's going to look more like one fluid movement, like that. Now you may find that you'd rather hold this chord in this manner, where your middle finger is actually covering the 7th fret of 2 strings. You can totally do that. But for me, I like, this is just my own personal go-to. But if you have larger fingers and you're going way up high where the frets are a little bit smaller, it might be a little more difficult. So you may decide that you'd like to do this. And if you're going to do transitions, then I end up doing something like that where I try to slide that finger up. Let me try one more time. So my pinky is still my anchor. My pinky is the one that I make sure he gets where he needs to go. And this finger follows, and then I'm able to add my index where he needs to go. So those are the two options for that particular chord where my index is based on that 6th fret. We're almost there. Okay, the next one is super easy. It's just barring that 10th fret. I would use my middle finger, and the reason why is no matter which version you're doing, whether it's all 4 fingers or if you're doing this one where it's covering the G and the C string with your middle finger is already on the G string, no matter which variation you're doing. So take that middle finger, move up, and then add a ring or the pinky, and then add pinky. So you could do it this way, or you could do it this way. I prefer my ring, but that kind of, some people may not be used to using the middle for barring. You can use your index, of course, to bar if you'd rather, if that's more comfortable for you, but for me, that's not as efficient. So try to use your middle for a little bit. The other thing too about using your middle finger for the full bar is it's your longest finger. And so, you know, to me, it just makes a lot more sense. If you can use the longer finger for that, why not? So I'm going to go through and play that entire B flat major scale using these chord variations. And you can kind of compare, if you will, to that example 4. So here's example 5, slowly. Yeah, and you can really hear the scale. It sounds really beautiful. And one thing about this particular one is it's starting us with that open G string. If you want to close it, you can. That way all of your chords are closed. Or middle finger. The reason I'm mentioning that is if you want to move the scale around, etc., etc. I'm playing it now as a B major scale instead of B flat major scale. Versus, or even example 6. Way up high, moving it to C, and then you can play a C major scale here. Now, I had mentioned that I'd play a little bit of an example. So the nearness of you, the beginning of that song, it's C. Well, I play it in the key of C. I could probably do it in B flat as well, but I'll start it in C. I have, that's the first chord shape, and then adding the next chord shape, the next chord shape, but we're going to skip this one and jump up here. It's not the It's the start of that song. Now, the chord changes, so then I need to know all of the chords that I could find in the next, all of the chord positions for the next one, but you kind of get the idea of you can move in between, or if you're stuck on a chord for a long time, like 8 beats of B flat, for example, and that's how I can create some movement, and that was me just playing the 2, or actually 3 notes and backward, forward and backward. You can do things like that to also kind of add to your sound, and it creates movement from chord to chord. And it's a great first step, as I mentioned, into chord melody. The other thing to keep in mind with this is I'm only showing you a major scale pattern. There's also minor scale patterns, as well as, I call them dominant 7 patterns because it's less scary than saying a mixolydian. But for me, being able to play, you know, B flat 7 in different places allows me to then be able to play other dominant 7 chords like G7. That sounds like just the nearness of. Right, so I'm just going through, I'm playing 1 G7 here. I am adding my pinky, which is just another note in the scale, and then I'm moving it up to another G7 up here, which just happens to be 4, 5, 3, 5. And then I'm moving it back down. And so being able to move within your chords in this manner and focusing on those transitions will allow you to make those transitions smoother. Um, they'll be able to be just more musical because of that. And you'll start noticing that maybe you'll feel more confident trying to add small elements like this into your soloing, perhaps, so it can be more full and not necessarily only single notes of your scales. So, just something to keep in mind. And just remembering and working on, I say one hand at a time. You notice I didn't tell you needed to be strumming with your index or your thumb. I used my thumb to ensure that I had nice, solid strums on my strings, but my focus was really working on my fretting hand and ensuring that each transition was clean and clear. And so going back and forth, and even maybe working on 2 chords, 3 chords in one sitting, going back and forth, and making sure I have an anchor finger, a finger that always stays on the fretboard. That's not always possible, but it's good to try. So I hope you're able to use everything we discussed: goal setting, warm ups and scales, and really focusing on chord transitions to help you get your playing, past the plateau that you might be hitting right now. For me, I find that goal setting is the most important because that's what's going to help you keep your focus. And then once see your goals and say, okay, I'm going to make sure that in 6 months I'm able to do X, Y, and Z, that your practice will become much more focused, and you won't be floundering as much going, what should I practice? Because if you know where you want to go, then it's a lot easier to choose the correct things to practice for that. So thank you so much for going on this journey with Craig and myself. It's always a pleasure to get to work with Ukulele Magazine and to be able to work with you and help you on your musical journey.